You wake up in the palace, and the first thing you notice is the weight of the gold against your collarbone. The necklace they placed on you last night after the banquet, heavy enough that you have to adjust how you hold your head, and you think about how strange it is that wealth feels like burden before it feels like anything else. The marble floors are cold, even though it's summer. Cold in that particular way that Roman stone stays cold no matter how much sun pours through the windows, and your sandals make a soft sound as you walk that echoes in a way that reminds you how large these rooms are, how much empty space exists between you and anything that might feel like home. You're Messalina, which means you're the emperor's wife, which means your days are measured in appearances, in the careful choreography of being seen at the right moment by the right people. And right now, in this moment before the day truly begins, you're standing in a corridor that smells like imported incense from Egypt. That particular sweetness that's supposed to mask the smell of too many people living too close together in a place that was never designed for comfort. You can hear men's voices from somewhere deeper in the palace, that low rumble of political discussion that never quite stops, that continues through meals and baths, and probably through sleep, and you've learned not to listen too carefully, because the moment you understand what they're saying is the moment you become implicated in it. There's a slave girl arranging flowers in a vase near the window, white roses that were brought in this morning, and she doesn't look at you when you pass, keeps her eyes down in that way that you used to think was respect, but now understand is something more complicated, something closer to fear of being noticed. The sun is hitting the marble in that particular way that makes everything look clean and eternal, and if you didn't know better, you'd think this was safety. You'd think this was power. You'd think that being the emperor's wife meant you were protected. She begins to notice the quality of silence that follows her through the palace. Not the absence of sound, but a specific kind of quiet that happens when people stop talking because she's entered the room. And at first, she tells herself this is normal. This is respect. But respect doesn't make her spine feel cold, doesn't make her aware of every slave's position relative to her body. The guards who are supposed to protect her have started standing differently, not at attention, but at readiness. And there's a distinction there that she's only now learning to read, the way their hands rest closer to their weapons, the way their eyes track her movements with the kind of focus that isn't about security but about documentation, about being able to report later exactly where she went and who she spoke to. She starts noticing the same faces in different parts of the palace at times that don't make sense, a particular scribe who seems to be everywhere she is, a freedman who keeps appearing in corridors she thought were private, and she realizes with the kind of clarity that feels like nausea that she's not being protected by the palace systems, she's being processed by them, recorded and analyzed and probably discussed in rooms she'll never enter by men whose names she doesn't know. The emperor, her husband, has started looking at her differently too, not with anger or disappointment, but with a kind of distant calculation, the way you might look at a problem that needs solving, a variable that needs to be eliminated from an equation, and when she tries to speak to him about it, he smiles in a way that doesn't reach his eyes and tells her she's imagining things, which is how she knows with absolute certainty that she's not imagining anything. The palace has always been watching, that's its nature, but now it's watching her specifically. Now the entire mechanism of imperial surveillance has turned its attention to her, and she understands that she's transitioned from being part of the system to being its target, from wife to problem, from person to case that needs to be closed. She tries to find allies and discovers that everyone she thought was her friend has already made calculations about their own survival that don't include her, and the realization of this happens slowly, in small moments of betrayal that accumulate like water drops until she's drowning in the understanding that she is completely alone. The senators' wives who used to sit with her during public ceremonies now arrange themselves at careful distances, not obviously shunning her but creating space, creating plausible deniability for later when they'll need to say they never really knew her well. Her own attendants, women who have dressed her and bathed her and listened to her fears, have started responding to her questions with careful neutrality, their faces arranged in expressions of professional blankness that tell her they've already been interviewed, already been asked what they know, already been offered the choice between her friendship and their own continued existence. She tries to speak with the emperor again, finds him in his private study surrounded by scrolls and advisors, and when she enters the room, the conversation stops in a way that makes it clear they were talking about her, and he looks at her with something that might be pity, except pity would require him to see her as human rather than as inconvenient. And he tells her they'll talk later, which is the kind of dismissal that sounds polite but functions as threat. The worst part is how normal everything continues to look, how the palace keeps operating with the same routines and rituals, how the slaves still bring food and the guards still change shifts, and the sun still moves across the marble floors, creating the same patterns of light and shadow it's created for decades, as if her erasure is so unremarkable that it doesn't even disturb the basic functioning of empire. She spends a night lying awake in her chambers, listening to the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, trying to determine if they're the normal footsteps of palace life or the specific footsteps of people coming for her, and she realizes that she can't tell the difference anymore, that the mechanisms of ordinary palace operation and the mechanisms of her destruction are probably the same mechanisms, operated by the same people, just pointed in a different direction. But if you think isolation was the worst thing the imperial system did to its empresses, you haven't yet understood what happened when isolation stopped being sufficient, when the decision moved from surveillance to elimination. She's in the garden when the messenger arrives, one of the palace freedmen whose face she's seen 1,000 times but whose name she's never learned, and he's carrying a sealed document that he hands to her without expression, without ceremony, without any of the elaborate formality that usually accompanies imperial communications, and that lack of formality tells her everything before she even breaks the seal. The document is brief, probably drafted by a secretary who writes these kinds of things regularly, who has a template for imperial divorces and exile orders, and the language is administrative, clinical, referring to her not by name but by legal relationship that is now being terminated, and there's a list of her assets that will be confiscated and a date by which she needs to be gone from Rome, and at the bottom is the emperor's seal, pressed into red wax that's still slightly warm, which means this was decided recently, which means maybe an hour ago she was still the empress, and now she's simply a woman who used to be. She looks up and the messenger is already walking away, his job completed, and she notices that the slaves who were working in the garden have disappeared, not obviously fled, but simply absent, and she understands that everyone already knew, that the entire palace had been informed before she was, that her life had ended before she'd been notified of her own death. She goes back to her chambers and finds them different, not dramatically changed, but subtly wrong, and it takes her a moment to realize that things are missing. Small, valuable things, jewelry and personal items, and she understands that the inventory has already been taken, her possessions already claimed by the state, and she's looking at a room that legally doesn't belong to her anymore, even though she's still standing in it. The silence of the palace has changed quality again, is no longer watchful but conclusive, and when she walks through the corridors trying to find someone to explain this to, trying to find some avenue of appeal or mercy, she encounters only closed doors and averted eyes, and the few people who do look at her do so with the kind of embarrassed discomfort you show to someone who's already dead but hasn't realized it yet. And she wasn't the only one. This is what matters. This is what transforms personal tragedy into evidence of system. Because what happened to her wasn't exception, wasn't anomaly. It was standard operating procedure for an empire that had learned how to eliminate problems without leaving marks that history would care about. Octavia was younger, Nero's first wife before he decided he wanted someone else, and she had the particular disadvantage of being loved by the people, which meant her removal had to look like justice rather than murder, had to resemble a legal correction rather than an act of imperial convenience. They accused her of adultery, the standard charge, the reliable one, the accusation they kept in a drawer for moments like this, and everyone understood immediately that it was false, including the slaves who were tortured to provide the necessary testimony, who held out until the pain rewired their ability to think, until they repeated whatever words the interrogators needed them to say so the process could continue. She was exiled to Pandateria, the same bleak island Augustus had used for his own daughter, because Rome recycled exile the way it recycled execution, efficiently, without imagination, using the same places, the same methods, the same scripts, as if the empire itself were following an eternal checklist. She remained there for weeks, suspended between life and death, while Nero debated whether isolation was enough or whether public sentiment required something irreversible. The soldiers arrived early, the kind of early that feels like violation, without warning, without explanation, stepping into her quarters with the heavy certainty of men who already know how the morning will end. She didn't plead. That came later. First, she asked if she could write a letter to her brother, a small act of humanity offered to someone who no longer qualified as human in the eyes of the state, and they told her there wasn't time, and the way they said it told her the order was fresh, urgent, executed quickly so that pity wouldn't have time to interfere. The room where they took her was small, plain, a servant's bathing space with plaster walls that trapped sound, and when they held her down and opened her veins in the bath, it wasn't theatrical or ceremonial, just procedural. The water was lukewarm, not warm enough to comfort, not cold enough to numb, and the smell of iron rose before the color changed, that sharp metallic scent that tells the body something irreversible is happening. The blood didn't gush, it pulsed in slow rhythmic waves that matched her heartbeat, each pulse a little weaker than the last, each one tinting the water from clear to pink, to the deep opaque red of something that should never have been seen by candlelight. The soldiers didn't watch. They stood outside the door, listening, waiting for the silence that would confirm completion, waiting to return to Rome with the message that the problem had been solved, that Nero was now free to marry Poppaea without the burden of a living former wife who might inspire sympathy or hesitation. Julia, Augustus's daughter, suffered a different kind of death, the kind that unfolds over decades, the kind where the body survives long after the life has stopped functioning. Her father, the man who shaped the empire, who built a government on legislation about morality and family, exiled her for adultery, for behavior that may have been rebellion or may have just been human. And again Pandateria swallowed her, because the empire rarely needed new solutions when the old ones were so reliable. She stayed there for 5 years before being transferred to a marginally less hostile location, a movement that changed nothing about her condition because exile wasn't a place. It was a sentence of perpetual suspension, a slow unmaking. Her name became forbidden in Augustus's presence, a taboo word, an erasure formalized by law and maintained by fear. She grew older in isolation, watching the seasons change on an island where no one was allowed to look her in the eye long enough to acknowledge she existed, understanding with devastating clarity that her father had decided that being his daughter was a status he could revoke, that love was not a bond, but an administrative category. When she finally died, after 20 years of being legally absent, Rome didn't notice. No ceremonies, no mourning, not even gossip. She simply vanished from the world the way she had been made to vanish from memory, and the only reason anyone today knows she died is because an imperial accountant recorded the cost of her burial, reducing a life that once shaped the politics of an empire to an entry in a budget, an expense filed alongside grain shipments and palace repairs. Messalina's ending came fast, faster than Octavia's or Julia's, because she'd made the mistake of acting rather than waiting, had married another man while still technically married to the emperor, probably out of desperation or political calculation, or maybe just because she was young and didn't fully understand that empresses don't get to make choices that deviate from imperial convenience. The Emperor Claudius was apparently the last person to know, was in the middle of a banquet when someone finally told him, and his advisors moved immediately to contain the situation, which meant contain her. And by the time he'd sobered up enough to ask questions, the decision had already been implemented, the order already given, the soldiers already sent to the gardens where she'd fled, hoping for sanctuary at her mother's tomb. There are different versions of what happened next, which is what always happens when powerful people die messily. The official story gets refined and adjusted until it's clean enough for history. But what seems consistent is that someone handed her a dagger and told her to do it herself. And when she hesitated too long, when she couldn't make herself press the blade in, someone else did it for her, probably a tribune of the Praetorian Guard whose name we don't know, who was just doing his job, just following orders, just eliminating a problem as efficiently as possible. She was 22 years old, had been empress for 7 years, and she died without trial or formal accusation. Died because the people who managed imperial power decided she'd become too complicated to keep alive. And the interesting part, the part that tells you everything about how this system worked, is that Claudius allegedly couldn't remember ordering her execution, claimed later that he'd been too drunk, which might have been true, or might have been the kind of convenient amnesia that powerful men develop when they need distance from decisions they've authorized. Her children survived, which was a gift in that context, which meant someone decided that eliminating her was sufficient, that the problem was contained once she was dead, and the palace continued operating exactly as it had before. The same routines and rituals and banquets, as if nothing had happened, as if she'd never existed, as if the machine of empire was so large and well-designed that one woman's death didn't even create a ripple in its functioning. We look at marble busts in museums now and see faces without names. Generic empresses whose identities have been worn away by time or deliberately erased by emperors who wanted to remove evidence of their former wives from public memory. And we call this art, call this history, call this the ancient world, as if distance makes it less real or less relevant. We've turned their destruction into footnotes, into brief paragraphs in textbooks about imperial succession, into historical facts that we memorize without feeling, without letting ourselves imagine the actual woman receiving the actual message that her actual life was being administratively terminated. Messalina becomes a symbol of sexual excess. Julia becomes a cautionary tale about disobeying fathers. Octavia becomes a tragic but necessary casualty of Nero's reign. And in doing this, in turning them into types rather than people, we participate in the same erasure that Rome began. We finish the work that the empire started of making their suffering abstract, theoretical, historical, in the way that means not quite real. The system that destroyed them didn't end with Rome's fall, didn't die when the last emperor was deposed. It just learned to wear different clothes, to speak different languages, to operate through different institutions that still understand the fundamental principle that some people are expendable, that some bodies exist primarily as problems to be solved, that power protects itself by eliminating witnesses rather than changing behavior. We still exile inconvenient women to metaphorical islands, still call it necessary, still make it legal, still let it happen in silence while life continues around the edges of their disappearance. And the fact that we don't use the word empress anymore doesn't mean we've stopped creating the conditions that make this possible. Doesn't mean we've dismantled the basic architecture of power that allows it. A memory becomes a myth only when the screams have finally faded into the marble.